It was almost 7 p.m. when I finally looked up from my screen. The office around me bathed in that kind of low amber light that makes everything feel just a little too quiet. Most nights ended this way, me alone in the corner office, fingers stiff from typing, eyes dry from not blinking enough. I told myself I liked the silence. Maybe I even believed that once. That evening felt no different, until I realized he was still there. The intern. Alex. 24, respectful, observant, quieter than most I'd mentored, but sharp. Always watching. I had assumed he left hours ago, like everyone else. I rubbed my neck, trying to ease the tension, pretending I hadn't just flinched at the realization I wasn't as alone as I thought. I was about to say something harmless, maybe a little sarcastic to mask the surprise, when his voice interrupted the stillness. "You don't even know what you're worth, do you?" That's what he said. No warning. No build-up. Just a sentence that split the room like a sudden draft through a closed door. I froze, waiting for the smirk, some awkward attempt at flirtation or misplaced bravado. But there was none. His face was calm. His voice even. No edge. No humor. Just a strange, steady honesty. And I hated that it made me pause. I asked why he thought he knew anything about me. He didn't flinch. "I don't," he said. "But I notice things. You walk like you're carrying everything and pretending it's light." I turned away, not because I disagreed, but because I didn't know what to do with the truth of it. I stared at my laptop screen, but the numbers blurred. My mind wasn't there anymore. His words echoed, quiet but precise, like the slow turn of a forgotten key in a locked drawer. And then, just like that, he went back to his notes, as if he hadn't cracked something open inside me. Maybe he really was just the intern. Another eager young man trying to prove himself. Or maybe he was something else. Something I hadn't expected. And what lingered wasn't the words themselves, but the way he looked at me. Not like I was his boss. Not like I was older. Just like I was visible. And maybe what unsettled me most was the simple, stubborn truth underneath it all. I believed him. I used to believe routine was a form of power. That if I could control my mornings, command my schedule, stay 3 steps ahead in every meeting, then nothing could really touch me. At 42, I had everything I thought I wanted. A respected title, a corner office, clean lines on my resume. I had built my life like a staircase, one measured step after another, never skipping, never slipping. And yet lately, I had started to notice things. Not big things. Just moments. Like how I avoided my own reflection when the elevator doors closed. Or how I'd sit in my car for 10 extra minutes before walking into the house at night. Or how the silence in my apartment used to feel peaceful, but now pressed in like a second skin. It's strange how quickly comfort can shift into numbness. I didn't feel unhappy, exactly. I just felt neutral. As if someone had turned the color down on my world and I hadn't realized it until everything looked like the same muted gray. My friendships had softened into polite check-ins. Birthday texts. Forwarded articles. Nothing that asked how I really was. My marriage had ended years ago, not in fire, but in quiet retreat, like a tide that never returned. We said we'd stay friends. We didn't. There were no betrayals, no screaming matches, just a shared understanding that something had faded and neither of us had the energy to chase it. After that, I stopped letting people close. Not intentionally, at first. But slowly. Subtly. I answered less. I shared less. I became less. And no one seemed to notice. Or maybe they did, but assumed I liked it that way. And maybe I did, for a while. Work became the safe place. Deadlines didn't lie. Meetings didn't ask if you were okay. I liked being sharp. Respected. I liked when people listened. But respect is not the same as being seen. And that realization, as quiet as it was, had started to scratch at me in recent months. I had perfected a kind of elegance, the kind that made me untouchable, and yet increasingly invisible. People assumed I didn't need anything, that I had it all figured out, that I didn't feel the ache of coming home to an empty kitchen, or sleeping on just one side of the bed, or trying to remember the last time someone looked at me like I was more than just capable. I had trained myself not to need that. Or at least not to admit it. So when he arrived, I barely noticed. Just another intern, I thought. Another ambitious name in an endless rotation. He was younger, observant, polite. Nothing out of place. But there was something different. Something I couldn't define yet. I ignored it. Told myself it was nothing. That he would blend into the background like the rest. That I was fine. That I didn't need anyone to see me. Not anymore. Until him. It was a Thursday when I first realized he unnerved me. Not in a threatening way, not in the way most people mean when they say that, but in the quieter way that makes you notice someone lingering in your thoughts when they shouldn't. Alex had only been there for 3 weeks, yet he moved through the office like he'd been studying it for years. He asked smart questions, never interrupted, and he listened. Really listened. That alone would have set him apart from the rest. But it was more than that. It was the way he looked at me. Not often. Not in a way that would draw attention. Just long enough. Steady enough. As if I were a puzzle no one else had bothered to study. I remember the first time it truly hit me. It was around 1840. I just ended a call with legal, my voice clipped from a day that had worn me thinner than I liked to admit. I muttered something under my breath. Nothing important. Just a half-joke about how people only called when they needed something fixed. And from across the room, without even looking up, he said quietly, "Maybe they call you because you always make things right." I looked at him then. Really looked. And I didn't say anything, because I didn't have a response. No intern had ever said anything like that. No colleague either. It wasn't flattery. It was something quieter. Sharper. Like being seen when you weren't asking to be. That night, I stayed later than I needed to. Told myself it was for documentation. It wasn't. I was stalling. Watching him out of the corner of my eye. Watching how he worked, how he leaned over his notes with this calm intensity, like there was nowhere else he'd rather be. Around 19:15, I stood to leave. I didn't say goodbye. But just as I reached for my coat, he asked if I needed help carrying anything to my car. I paused. Just a beat too long. Then shook my head. "I'm good," I said more sharply than I meant to. He didn't react. Just nodded and went back to his work. But the next morning, when I arrived at 8 o'clock, there was a coffee on my desk. Black. 1 sugar. I hadn't told him how I took it. I hadn't told anyone in months. There was no note. No explanation. Just the coffee. Still warm. I stared at it for a long time. And then I drank it. Slowly. Silently. And for the first time in longer than I cared to admit, I didn't feel quite so invisible. That was the beginning. I didn't know it then. Just that the coffee was warm. And that part of me, the part I'd buried, had started to stir. That weekend felt heavier than it should have. There was no incident, no confrontation, nothing dramatic to point to. Just silence, a stillness that stretched too long between the moments I usually ignored. Saturday came, and I followed my routine like clockwork. Coffee at 8:30. Laundry at 9 o'clock. Emails I didn't need to check, answered out of habit. Everything in its place. And yet, nothing felt quite right. I kept thinking about that coffee. About how it had been exactly the way I liked it. No one had done that in years. I told myself it was nothing. Just a thoughtful intern trying to make a good impression. But the thought lingered. Not because of the coffee, but because someone had noticed. Someone had paid attention without being asked. I wasn't used to that. I didn't know what to do with it. The silence in my apartment wasn't new, but it echoed differently now. It wasn't peace anymore. It was presence. A presence I hadn't realized was missing until it flickered back in for a moment and then was gone again. I caught myself reaching for my phone once, fingers hovering over his name in the employee directory, then pulling back like I'd touched something too hot. What would I even say? Thank you for the coffee. Thank you for noticing I exist. Sunday night, I poured a glass of wine, sat on the couch with a book I didn't open, and stared at the bookshelf across from me. It was lined with framed awards, certificates, perfect little tokens of who I used to be. And none of them felt like they belonged to me anymore. Not because I hadn't earned them, but because somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being a person and started being a performance. Reliable. Efficient. Composed. That's what people saw. And maybe that's what I wanted them to see. Maybe it was safer than admitting I missed the days when someone looked at me with more than just professional respect. When they looked at me with warmth. Curiosity. Desire. I hadn't realized how much I had shut down until someone opened a window I thought had been sealed for good. And now, everything felt different. Not better. Not worse. Just, awake. Monday morning, I stood in front of my closet longer than usual. My hand hovered over a navy blazer, the one I always wore for presentations. I hesitated. Then reached for something softer. Not for him. For me. At 7:45, I stepped into the elevator. At 7:49, the doors opened. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't stepping into routine. I was stepping into uncertainty. And I wasn't sure which part of me wanted that more. He became part of the background before I realized he'd stepped into the foreground. At first, Alex was just there. Quietly present. He didn't ask for attention. Didn't insert himself into conversations he wasn't invited into. But he stayed long after others had packed up and left. He lingered in those quiet, after-hours pockets of the day when the office emptied and the air changed. Most interns kept their heads down. Most clocked out the second they could. But Alex stayed. Not because he had to. I could tell. He worked steadily, efficiently, but without urgency. There was no rush in him. No scramble to impress. He simply existed in the room like he belonged there. Like he'd chosen the stillness. And then, slowly, he started noticing things. Small things. Like when I switched to flats mid-afternoon. Or when I moved my chair slightly off-center after a hard call. Or the way I wrapped my fingers around my mug when something irritated me. He never commented. Not at first. But I felt it. The quiet awareness. It was unnerving, not unsafe, but vulnerable. I had spent years refining a presence that deflected emotion. That kept things clean, composed, contained. But around him, I felt slightly exposed. Not because he pushed. But because he didn't. He gave me space. And in that space, I began noticing myself again. One afternoon, around 16:15, I dropped a folder full of printed briefs. I muttered a curse, knelt to gather them, and he was already there crouched beside me, silent, helping. When I reached for a page, his hand brushed mine. Just for a second. Just enough. I pulled back without thinking. He didn't say anything. Just offered a faint smile and kept stacking the pages. As he stood, he handed me the folder and said, "Nothing worth building comes without mess." The line wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't flirtation. It was just, honest. I nodded, unsure what to say. That evening, I replayed the moment. Not the touch. Not the words. Just the calm in his eyes when he said them. I started wondering if I was imagining it, seeing something that wasn't there. But he kept showing up. Earlier now. Sometimes already in the conference room, reviewing notes. He made himself useful. Not performative. Just precise. Quiet. Intentional. He never overstepped. But he never disappeared either. And I began looking for him. Not deliberately. Not at first. But it happened. A glance toward the back of the room. A pause when I heard the elevator. A moment of stillness when I caught his voice in meetings, low, measured, deliberate. I wasn't prepared for how much space he'd quietly taken in a life I thought had no room left. And I wasn't prepared for how much I missed him when he wasn't there. It happened so quietly I almost convinced myself it didn't matter. One of those evenings when the sky darkens too quickly and the office empties without ceremony. The lights hummed above me, that familiar office quiet I usually filled with motion. I was reviewing slides for a client pitch when he stepped into the doorway, holding a folder I'd forgotten I asked for. He didn't speak. Just set it on the edge of my desk and waited. There was something different about him that evening. Not in how he looked, in how he felt. Grounded. Present. The air seemed to shift when he stood nearby. I reached for the folder, not thinking, and our fingers touched. Just briefly. But long enough to notice. My skin buzzed. Not in the dramatic way books describe. Smaller than that. Quieter. But real. And I didn't move. Neither did he. The moment held, suspended like a thread pulled tight, waiting to snap or unravel. I pulled away first. Slowly. Carefully. As if moving too quickly might break the illusion that we were still only colleagues. He stepped back just enough to leave space again. I stared at the folder. My heart steady, but my breath wasn't. It was nothing. But it wasn't. I told myself it was accidental. Unimportant. But the silence said otherwise. He didn't explain. He didn't joke. He just watched me for a second longer than necessary, then turned and walked away. I sat there for several minutes, unsure what unsettled me more, the touch, or how much I had wanted it to last. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about his hands. Not in a romantic way. Not even in a way I could define. Just, the weight of them. The steadiness. The way they didn't flinch. The next morning, I found a note tucked beneath my keyboard. No envelope. No name. Just a folded page in handwriting I instantly recognized. 8 words. You deserve to feel wanted. I stared at it for a long time, not knowing what to do. I wasn't angry. I wasn't embarrassed. I was quiet. Like someone had spoken aloud something I had only ever dared to whisper. I folded the note, placed it in my drawer, and locked it. Not to forget it. To protect it. The rest of the day passed like static, voices blurred, tasks done without memory. But underneath every conversation, every spreadsheet, one thought pulsed louder than the rest. I deserved to feel wanted. And somehow, that truth scared me more than the moment ever had. That night, I didn't turn on the lights when I got home. I walked through the hallway, dropped my keys in the bowl by the door, kicked off my shoes, and let the silence settle around me like it always did. But it felt different. Not soft. Not familiar. It felt sharp, like it was watching me back. I moved to the bedroom, stopped in the center of the floor, and stared at the closed closet door. For a while, I didn't move. Just breathed. Waiting, for what? I wasn't sure. Eventually, I stepped forward, opened the door, and let my fingers trace along the row of clothes I hadn't touched in years. There was a dress. Pale grey silk. Long sleeves. A subtle slit at the side. I used to wear it to evening events, back when I still accepted invitations. The fabric felt foreign in my hands. I held it up in the faint glow from the hallway. And I didn't want to put it back. I wanted to feel something. So I slipped it on. Slowly. Carefully. Like it might tear. The zipper caught once at my ribs, then slid into place. I walked to the mirror, the full-length one I usually passed without pause. I stood in front of it, bare feet on cold floor, hands loose at my sides, and waited for the reflection to settle. The woman staring back looked like me, but softer, sadder, and I couldn't stop looking at her. My hair was looser, my posture less rigid. There was a vulnerability in my face I hadn't allowed myself to see in years. I reached up, touched the hollow just beneath my collarbone, like that one gesture might explain why my throat felt so tight. I wasn't crying, but my eyes burned. And I didn't know if it was grief, or something that looked a little too much like hope. I had built armor for so long, I forgot what it felt like to wear something that revealed instead of concealed. I didn't want to be wanted for youth, or beauty, or even admiration. I just wanted to be wanted for being here, for being real, for being more than capable. The note echoed in my mind like a pulse. You deserve to feel wanted. And the worst part wasn't that I doubted it. The worst part was that I wanted to believe it. That some part of me, quiet, rusted, buried, still did. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dress, legs tucked beneath me, bare and silent. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't check email. I just breathed. And somewhere in that stillness, I admitted what I had been avoiding. I missed being seen. Not in meetings. Not in passing glances. But in a way that reached beneath all the noise. I had almost forgotten that part of me existed. Almost. But not quite. Not anymore. I arrived early the next morning. Earlier than usual. The sky was still a pale shade of blue, and the hallways hadn't filled yet. I told myself I needed time to prepare for a client call. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was I needed to see him before anyone else did. I needed to look him in the eye and remind myself that whatever I had started to feel wasn't real. Couldn't be. I stepped into the office at 7:18. The lights were already on. My pulse jumped. He was there. At my desk. Sitting in my chair. Reading through a printout like he belonged there. He looked up when I entered, startled for half a second, then calm again. That calmness unnerved me more than anything. I didn't say good morning. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it. We stood in silence. Then I said it. We need to talk. He set the paper down and waited. I could feel the words stacking in my throat, too many, too heavy. I told myself I was being professional. That I was protecting the dynamic. That I was drawing a line. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid. Afraid of how easy it had become to look forward to seeing him. Afraid of what the note had stirred in me. Afraid of what might happen if I let it keep stirring. This can't happen, I said. I don't even know what this is. But it can't happen. He took a slow breath. What do you think is happening? The way he asked it, steady, open, not defensive, made me pause. I don't know, I admitted. But it's not appropriate. He nodded. No shift in his expression. Then he said, I never asked for anything. I never expected anything. But I meant what I wrote. You deserve more than what you've settled for. I looked away. My throat tightened. I didn't want to feel anything. Not now. Not here. Especially not with him watching me like he already knew. You don't know what you're talking about, I said. You don't know me. His voice stayed soft. I don't. But I see you. That's all. I see you. The words hit harder than I wanted them to. Not because they were unfamiliar. But because they weren't. Because some part of me had been waiting a long time to hear them. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The silence between us said enough. Eventually, I walked to my desk, sat down, and opened my laptop. He stepped aside without a word. The moment passed. But it didn't dissolve. It stayed there, between us, unfinished. And somehow, that was the hardest part. I stayed late that evening. Not because I had to. Not because anyone asked. I stayed because I wasn't ready to go home and pretend nothing had changed. The silence in my apartment would have been louder than anything I was ready to face. By 18:30, most of the office had emptied. The sun had slipped behind the buildings outside my window. The city buzzed below, but up here, everything felt still. I sat in my chair, staring at the darkened skyline, hands folded in my lap. I hadn't spoken to him since that morning. He hadn't approached me. Hadn't hovered. He went about his day with the same quiet efficiency he always had. And yet, everything between us had shifted. Not in a dramatic way. Just, permanently. I opened the drawer and looked at the folded note again. The paper felt warmer than it should have. The words hadn't changed. But I had. You deserve to feel wanted. I read it once more, then closed the drawer. I didn't throw it away. I didn't hide it. I let it stay where it was. A reminder. Not of him, but of myself. Around 1910, I walked toward the restroom. As I passed the break room, I caught a glimpse of him through the glass. Sitting alone. Headphones on. Notebook open. Pen moving slowly across the page. I didn't stop. Didn't speak. But something inside me softened. Not longing. Not regret. Just understanding. He had never asked me for anything. And still, I'd given him more than I expected. That meant something. Back at my desk, I gathered my things and reached for my coat. As I slipped it on, I caught sight of myself in the window's reflection. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't look away. I just stood there. Watching. Not judging. Just being. My heels clicked softly on the floor as I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button. Waited. At 1918, the doors opened. I stepped inside. Just before they closed, I heard footsteps. Quick. Light. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I knew it was him. He didn't say my name. Didn't ask me to stay. But as the doors closed, I heard his voice. Steady. Clear. I hope you know it now. I didn't respond. Not with words. But I exhaled. One long, quiet breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. And maybe that was enough. Maybe, after everything, that was the beginning. Not of something with him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But of something with myself. Something real. Something I'd stopped believing I was still allowed to want. I stepped into the night. And this time, I didn't feel invisible. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next story.